Full story. Born with a disability, family believed. She was faking it and punished her for years. Welcome to our channel, Silent Wars. Today, we bring you a powerful full story about resilience, healing, and breaking free from the pain of the past. It's a journey that will touch your heart and inspire you to reflect on your own life. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss a full story. Let's begin this transformative journey together. Growing up in a small town in the Midwest, I always felt like an outsider, not just to my peers, but to my own family. I was born with a disability that affected the way I walked, something that, to most people, was hardly noticeable. But to my family, particularly my father, it was a constant source of frustration and anger. From a young age, I could feel the judgment in the way they looked at me, in the way they treated me. They never saw me for who I was, only for the disability they couldn't understand or accept. I wasn't born with a condition that could be easily explained, and because of that, I became a constant point of criticism. My father, who was always quick to express his frustrations, was convinced that my disability was nothing more than a cry for attention. He'd often accuse me of faking it, of trying to get sympathy or manipulate others. As a child, I didn't have the words or the courage to defend myself. I simply internalized the hurt, and it became a part of me. I started to believe his words. Maybe I was faking it. Maybe I was just trying to get attention, even though all I wanted was to be seen and loved for who I truly was. My mother, on the other hand, was passive. She never stepped in to defend me. She never spoke up when my father's words stung, and that silence made me feel even more abandoned. It was as if I didn't matter to her either. She'd go along with whatever my father believed, never offering any kind of support or understanding. It wasn't that she didn't care, but she never seemed to see me either. She allowed the cruelty to happen without question, and that made me feel like I was invisible, as though I didn't deserve any compassion or care. By the time I was a toddler, I could sense the disdain from both my parents. Their attitude towards me wasn't just about my disability, it was about the refusal to acknowledge who I was. My father believed that I was pretending, and my mother, too passive to challenge him, allowed it to go on. As I grew older, that feeling of being an outcast intensified. I was constantly punished for something I couldn't control, something that was part of who I was. Instead of being embraced, I was belittled. I was taught to hate the very part of myself that I couldn't change, and that feeling of rejection would stay with me for years to come. It wasn't just about my disability, it was about the way my family refused to accept me. They saw me as a problem, something to be fixed or corrected. And as a result, I felt like I was living in a world where I didn't belong, not even in my own family. This wasn't just physical pain, it was emotional torment. It was a kind of rejection that shaped the person I would become, and the scars of those early years would stay with me for a long time. Growing up with a disability, I quickly learned that the world wasn't kind to people who were different. From an early age, I was subjected to ridicule and teasing from my peers. But it wasn't just the kids who made my life harder, it was also the adults around me, including extended family members, who would laugh behind my back. My leg braces, which were a necessary part of my life, became a target for mockery. I had to endure snide comments and whispered jokes wherever I went. What hurt the most wasn't just their words, but the feeling that I didn't belong in a world that saw me as less than. There was one moment, at my wedding, that stands out in my memory. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life, a day to celebrate love and family. But someone, a distant relative, thought it was appropriate to mention my disability in front of all my guests. It was like no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to move past it, I couldn't escape the cruel reality of being judged for something I had no control over. Even in such a joyous moment, my disability was dragged into the conversation, reminding me that for some, it was the only thing that defined me. Despite the bullying, I learned early on to mask my pain. I taught myself how to laugh at the jokes, to pretend they didn't hurt. I wore a brave face, showing everyone that I could handle it. But inside, it was a different story. Every time someone pointed out how I walked differently or how I looked, it felt like a new wound. I didn't have the strength to fight back, or even to explain myself. I just had to endure. The constant reminders of my difference haunted me every single day. It felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter, and the world was forever pointing at it. But what people didn't see was the silent suffering that came with it. The emotional toll of trying to blend in when I didn't quite fit in. Over the years, I began to internalize the ridicule. I started to believe, at least part of me did, that maybe I was less than others. The teasing, the glances, the laughter, they chipped away at my self-worth, making me question if I was worthy of anything at all. The world didn't just make me feel different, it made me feel invisible, and at times, like I was just a burden. Despite it all, I kept pushing forward, trying to prove to myself and the world that I was more than my disability. But it wasn't easy. It was a lifelong battle with silent suffering that no one could see, and it still lingers in the corners of my mind. As I entered my 30s, I found myself facing a reality I had long ignored. For years, I had convinced myself that my disability wasn't that bad. It wasn't something that should hold me back. I had lived my life managing the discomfort, learning how to walk in a way that minimized the pain, and pushing through the numbness and tingling that sometimes flared up in my legs. I had gotten used to it, and in some ways, it felt like a normal part of life. But over time, the symptoms grew worse, and what had once been a mild annoyance became something far more severe. It started with more frequent pain in my legs, sharp, shooting pains that would sometimes stop me in my tracks. Then came the numbness, the tingling, and the sensation that my legs weren't even fully under my control. Walking became increasingly difficult. There were days when I could barely manage a few steps without feeling like I might collapse. It was terrifying, and it made me question whether the body I had grown so accustomed to was finally breaking down. I knew I needed to see a doctor, but even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I had simply lived with my condition for too long. Maybe it was just a side effect of aging, I thought. Maybe I was just overreacting. But after a visit to an orthopedic surgeon, the reality hit me harder than I had imagined. The surgeon was genuinely shocked by what he saw. He kept asking me questions, his disbelief growing with every answer. He took multiple pictures of my legs, shaking his head in astonishment. I could see the concern in his eyes. He told me that the damage to my lower extremities was far worse than anyone had realized, and that the years of avoiding treatment had led to nerve impingement and tissue damage. The surgeon made it clear that surgery was now my only option if I wanted to avoid permanent disability. His words were blunt but necessary. Without the procedure, I would likely lose the ability to walk normally for the rest of my life. I was taken aback. For years, I had convinced myself that my condition wasn't something that required drastic measures. I had told myself I was just different, that this was something I could live with. But now, the stakes were higher than I ever imagined. I stood there in the doctor's office, grappling with the overwhelming reality of what I had ignored for so long. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. I had to face the truth. This was no longer about simply managing my disability. It was about fixing it, and that meant surgery. The idea of going under the knife filled me with fear, but I also knew that it was my only chance for a better future. The decision wasn't easy, and I felt torn between the fear of change and the hope that this could finally be the solution I had been waiting for. As the date of my surgery drew closer, I found myself struggling with an internal battle that I hadn't expected. On one hand, I knew this surgery was my chance for a better life, to finally address the damage I had lived with for so long. But on the other hand, the question of whether I should tell my family about it weighed heavily on me. For years, I had kept my condition hidden from them, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. The thought of their judgment, their ridicule, and the shame I had endured for so long made me hesitant to even bring it up. From an early age, my family had dismissed my struggles as nothing more than a ploy for attention. Even when I was a child, they had insisted that my disability was something I was faking, that I was simply trying to get sympathy or manipulate those around me. Their refusal to acknowledge the reality of my condition had scarred me deeply, and the wounds had never truly healed. Now, with surgery on the horizon, I found myself asking, was it worth bringing up the past? Would telling them only reopen old wounds, ignite more arguments, and force me to relive the trauma of my childhood all over again? The fear of facing their skepticism and disbelief made me want to avoid the conversation altogether. It wasn't just about the surgery, it was about the years of emotional neglect I had endured. My family had never truly seen me for who I was. They had never accepted my condition, and they had never acknowledged the pain I carried with me every day. The idea of reaching out to them now, asking for their understanding or support, felt like a form of weakness. It felt like I was giving them control over a part of my life that I had long kept to myself. I didn't want to feel like I was seeking their approval, like I needed their validation in order to move forward. But deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their permission to take control of my own life. This surgery was my decision, my opportunity to heal, and no one, especially not my family, could take that away from me. The fear of judgment was real, but it no longer had the power to define me. In the end, I realized that I didn't have to share this part of my life with them. I was doing this for me, not for anyone else. And that, in itself, was the most empowering decision I could make. After years of struggling and avoiding the truth, I finally made the decision to go through with the surgery. But as the date approached, I found myself facing an emotional conflict that I hadn't fully prepared for. The surgery, which was supposed to be my chance to finally heal, became something much bigger in my mind. As I sat in the doctor's office, the reality of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just a procedure to fix my legs, it was a decision that would change the very core of who I was. For most of my life, I had built my identity around my disability. It wasn't just a physical condition, it had become a part of me, a part of my story. I had spent 30 years telling myself that there was nothing wrong with me, that I wasn't broken, just different. I had learned to embrace the ways in which my body worked and adapted. I had convinced myself that being different was okay, and I wore my disability like a badge of honor. But now, with the prospect of surgery, that sense of pride felt like it was slipping away. As I prepared for the surgery, a deep sense of loss crept over me. I realized that by agreeing to fix something I had lived with for so long, I was, in some way, agreeing with everyone who had ever told me I was broken. I wasn't just addressing a medical condition, I was confronting the deeply ingrained beliefs I had carried with me for years. The fear of losing that part of myself, of becoming normal, was overwhelming. I wasn't sure if I was ready to let go of the identity I had spent decades forming. In a way, it felt like I was betraying the very essence of who I was, like I was letting go of the person I had become, and that terrified me. There was a bittersweet feeling that accompanied the thought of surgery. Yes, it was the right thing to do for my future health, but emotionally, it felt like an irreversible shift. I had spent so many years accepting my disability and adapting to it that the idea of suddenly changing it felt wrong in some way. It was as if I was no longer going to be me. Instead, I was about to become someone else, a version of myself that didn't carry the weight of my condition, and while that should have been a relief, it felt like a loss. I was torn between the hope of walking without pain and the fear of losing a part of myself that had defined me for so long. The surgery came and went. It was a painful process, one that left me physically drained and emotionally worn out. The first few days after the operation were the hardest. The pain was intense, and I found myself relying on crutches for what felt like an eternity. The recovery was slow, and there were moments when I doubted whether it was worth it. But as difficult as the physical recovery was, it wasn't the hardest part of the whole experience. The hardest part was telling my family, especially my mother, the truth. For months, I had kept the surgery a secret, not out of malice, but out of fear. I feared the judgment, the guilt, and the inevitable questions that would follow. I didn't want to bring my family back into a part of my life they had never truly understood. The pain of my past, the years of neglect and ridicule, made me hesitant to share anything so deeply personal with them. I had convinced myself that this was my fight to face alone, that I didn't owe them an explanation. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the weight of the lie I was living. The guilt of hiding something so significant from my mother, the one person I had always wanted to understand me, was eating away at me. Eventually, the guilt became too much to bear. I knew I had to tell her. So I picked up the phone and dialed her number, my heart pounding in my chest. When she answered, I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Then, I just blurted it out. I told her that I had the surgery, that I had finally made the decision to fix something that had been with me for my entire life. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with shock and hurt. She was genuinely regretful, apologizing for not being there for me when I needed her most. For the first time in my life, I felt like she truly understood the gravity of what I had been through. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she finally saw the pain I had been carrying all these years. But despite the genuine remorse in her voice, it was too late. The years of neglect, the ridicule, and the emotional wounds I had endured couldn't be undone with an apology. It was a bittersweet moment, one filled with relief that she finally understood, but also with sadness that it had taken so long for her to realize. In the end, it was a moment of truth that brought a sense of closure, but it also left me with the realization that some things can never truly be fixed. The moment I shared my surgery on social media, the floodgates opened. I had kept the details of my surgery private for so long, but once the truth was out, everything changed. My phone began to ring constantly, my parents calling me over and over again. They were apologizing, expressing guilt for not being there for me when I needed them most. My mother, in particular, seemed genuinely remorseful. She said that she regretted not understanding the severity of my condition, that she wished she had been there to support me through the years of pain and struggle. At first, I was overwhelmed by their sudden change of heart. Part of me wanted to believe that their guilt was genuine, that they finally saw me for who I was, and understood the emotional toll their neglect had taken on me. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was too little, too late. The years of emotional distance, the ridicule, and the pain they had caused me couldn't just be erased with a phone call or an apology. No matter how many times they said they were sorry, the scars of my past with them remained. My mother even offered to come and help me recover. She suggested visiting me, helping me with day-to-day tasks while I was on crutches. The gesture was kind, and a part of me appreciated it. But I also felt conflicted. How could I trust them now, after all the years of neglect? Could I really open myself up to their support when I had spent so many years learning to live without it? Their guilt felt real, but it also felt like an attempt to fix something that couldn't be fixed. I had built my life without their support, and now I was expected to just let them back in. I struggled with the idea of forgiveness. I wanted to believe that people could change, that my parents could learn from their mistakes and become the supportive, understanding figures I had always needed them to be. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive them for the years of pain they had caused. The wounds from my childhood, from their lack of care, ran deep. And though I could appreciate their attempts to make amends, I knew that the past had left an indelible mark on me. I wasn't sure if that mark could ever be erased, no matter how much they regretted their actions. The realization settled in. Forgiveness is a process, and healing takes time. For now, all I could do was take the time I needed to heal, both physically and emotionally, without relying on them to fix what had been broken for so long. As I struggled with my own challenges, I soon realized that there was another deeply painful story unfolding within my husband's family, one that I had been unaware of until it was too late. His youngest brother, Joseph, had been subjected to years of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of their parents. As I began to learn the full extent of Joseph's past, I was completely devastated. It was a story of neglect and cruelty that no child should ever have to endure. And yet Joseph had suffered silently, carrying the weight of that pain on his own. Growing up, Joseph had always seemed a bit withdrawn and socially awkward, and I, like many others, assumed that was simply his nature. But the more I got to know him, the more I began to see cracks in that facade, the signs of deep trauma that he had never shared with anyone. It wasn't until I overheard my husband talking about his childhood that I learned the truth about what Joseph had endured. His father, a man who was known for his cruelty and paranoia, had started abusing Joseph when he was just a toddler. The abuse didn't end with his father's departure. It only escalated when his mother took over. Joseph's siblings, including my husband, had been complicit in the abuse, turning a blind eye to what was happening under their roof. I was shocked and horrified. How could my husband, the man I loved, have been a part of this? How could he not understand the severity of the situation? His response, when I confronted him, was one of denial and defense. He justified his actions by saying that they were all told Joseph wasn't truly their brother, and that the abuse was simply something they had learned to ignore. The lack of remorse, the lack of understanding, it was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I knew I had to do something to protect Joseph, to stand up for him in a way that no one else had. And so, I took a stand. I intervened. In doing so, I unknowingly uncovered a dark and ugly truth about my husband's family. The abuse had been hidden for years, swept under the rug as if it didn't exist. Joseph had been left to carry the emotional scars of that abuse on his own, without anyone offering help or understanding. It was clear that his past had shaped him in ways I hadn't fully realized, and now, as an adult, Joseph was still haunted by the pain of what he had lived through. By standing up for Joseph, I found myself in a position I never expected, questioning my marriage and my own beliefs about loyalty and family. But I knew I couldn't turn away from the truth. Joseph needed someone to stand by him, and I would be that person. In that moment, I realized that my decision to speak out for him was not just about protecting him, it was about breaking the cycle of silence and abuse in a family that had hidden its darkest secrets for far too long. As I helped Joseph escape the toxic environment he had been trapped in for so many years, something within me shifted. I had spent so long ignoring the painful truths about my husband's family, convincing myself that it wasn't my place to get involved. But when I saw Joseph suffering firsthand, I couldn't sit back any longer. Standing up for him became more important than keeping the peace in my marriage. It was no longer about maintaining the facade of a happy home, it was about doing the right thing, even if it meant breaking the silence that had shielded my husband and his family from the consequences of their actions. My husband, however, didn't see it that way. When I stepped in to help Joseph, He didn't understand why I had to get involved. He saw it as me interfering in family matters, trying to fix something that didn't concern me. But how could I sit by and watch as Joseph, my brother-in-law, continued to suffer in silence? How could I pretend everything was fine when it was clear that his past abuse was still tormenting him? My husband's indifference to Joseph's pain was something I couldn't ignore. The more I tried to push for action, the more my husband withdrew, accusing me of causing trouble in our marriage and not respecting his family dynamics. At first, I tried to reason with him, to make him understand the urgency of the situation, but he refused to acknowledge the severity of what had happened, and that's when I realized that our values were no longer aligned. I couldn't keep excusing his behavior, and I couldn't stand by and watch as he refused to take responsibility for his actions. It wasn't just about the abuse Joseph had suffered, it was about the way my husband had turned a blind eye to it for so many years. His inaction was just as damaging as the abuse itself. The conflict between us grew worse with every argument, and eventually, I made the painful decision to leave him. I filed for divorce, knowing that I could no longer stay in a marriage where the truth was so easily ignored. It wasn't an easy decision. There was a part of me that wanted to fix things, to try and salvage what we had, but I realized that I couldn't do that at the expense of my integrity or my sense of justice. My decision wasn't just about ending my marriage, it was about taking a stand for what was right, and for the person I had become. By standing up for Joseph, I found my own voice, and in the end, I knew that walking away from my marriage was the only way to truly begin healing for both Joseph and myself. Joseph's journey to recovery was not an easy one. It was filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But with the unwavering support of my parents and the guidance of therapy, he slowly began to heal. There were days when it seemed like progress would never come, when his anxiety and depression seemed too overwhelming to overcome. But Joseph was determined, and over time, he started to rebuild his life. He went back to school, something he had given up on for years, and took the first steps toward independence by learning to drive. The freedom that came with driving was a huge milestone for him, a symbol of the control he was starting to regain in his life. As he gained more independence, he also began dating. Though it was a small step, it marked a significant shift in his mindset. He was learning to trust again, and most importantly, he was learning to enjoy life despite the scars of his past. However, no matter how much progress Joseph made, the wounds of his childhood would always be a part of him. The emotional scars from the abuse he had endured, the years of neglect and torment, couldn't be fully erased. But that didn't mean he couldn't live a meaningful life. In fact, the very fact that he was continuing to push forward, despite everything he had been through, was a testament to his strength and resilience. Unfortunately, his family wasn't ready to let go of the past. His mother and siblings continued to guilt him for choosing to leave and not take care of his mother in her old age. They didn't understand that Joseph's life wasn't theirs to control, that he had the right to carve out his own path, free from the weight of their expectations. Slowly but surely, Joseph started to see this truth for himself. He realized that his life was his own to live, and the only way to truly heal was to step away from the toxic dynamics that had held him captive for so long. As for me, I had also begun my own journey of healing. I had come to terms with the fact that my family would never fully understand or support me in the way I needed. For years, I had sought their approval and validation, but now I understood that I had to stop waiting for something from them that they weren't capable of giving. I had freed myself from the guilt and shame they had imposed on me. Watching Joseph take control of his life was a reminder that healing often comes from breaking free from distancing yourself from the people and environments that have held you back. In the end, I realized that sometimes the path to redemption and healing is not about reconciliation with family, but about reclaiming your own power and moving forward. Life is full of challenges that often leave emotional scars, especially when we experience neglect or rejection from those we love. However, one of the most powerful lessons we can learn is that true healing often begins with setting boundaries and choosing to break free from toxic relationships, even if those relationships are family ties. It's never easy to let go of the past, especially when it involves people we once trusted. But peace can only come when we stop carrying the weight of others' guilt and shame. As we age, it's important to remember that our worth is not defined by the approval of others, but by our own self-understanding and the strength to choose what's best for our health and happiness. Whether it's standing up for ourselves or someone in need, true healing comes when we choose to live authentically, free from the fear of judgment. There's immense power in embracing our past and moving forward with compassion for ourselves. Age is a gift that brings perspective, and it's never too late to prioritize our well-being, nurture healthy relationships, and let go of those that no longer serve us. By doing so, we open the door to deeper peace and fulfillment in our lives. Thank you so much for watching this full story. We hope it inspired you and gave you the strength to face your own challenges. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to Silent Wars for more powerful stories. Your support means the world to us, and we're excited to share more content with you. See you in the next video.